The first warning sign should have been how interested my mother suddenly became in our vacation. Not in the normal way, not the kind where a parent asks where you're staying or whether you packed adapters for overseas outlets. She wanted numbers. Exact numbers. Flight costs, hotel costs, restaurant reservations, excursion packages. Every time she asked something, it sounded less like curiosity and more like she was mentally adding everything together in real time, running a calculation she hadn't told anyone about yet. At first I didn't think much of it, because my mother had always been strange about money, especially other people's money. Growing up, she treated finances like public information if you were family. Privacy didn't exist in our house. If one person got a raise, everyone knew. If someone bought a car, the entire family debated whether they deserved it. If someone spent what she considered too much on shoes, furniture, or anything remotely non-essential, she discussed it like she was chairing a government investigation into character. When I was 23 and bought my first decent television after years of eating instant noodles through college, she stared at it for 10 solid seconds before saying, "You know your sister still has that little broken Walmart one in her apartment." That was how she operated. Nothing could simply belong to you. Everything had to pass through the invisible courtroom inside her head first. Still, I told myself the vacation questions meant nothing serious. Elena didn't think so either, at first. We were sitting at the kitchen counter one night going through our travel checklist while she highlighted things on her phone, and I tried to locate my passport somewhere in the office drawer disaster pile. "You think your mom's judging us?" Elena asked casually. I laughed and said my mom judged people for buying strawberries out of season. Elena smiled at that, but it wasn't a relaxed smile. It was the kind she wore when she already knew something I hadn't accepted yet. My wife had spent 6 years learning my family the same way people learn to recognize dangerous weather, slowly, carefully, by pattern. She noticed things long before I did. I just wasn't ready to admit how bad some of those things really were, because admitting it felt like dismantling something I had spent years constructing. The idea that my family was difficult but ultimately fine, that every problem was temporary, that underneath the noise, everyone meant well. The vacation mattered more to us than most people would understand from the outside. It wasn't some luxury trip. We had been saving for almost a year because both of us were exhausted in ways that sleep had stopped fixing. Elena worked brutal hospital shifts that left her emotionally hollow half the time, coming home with that particular look of someone who had spent all day carrying other people's worst moments and had nowhere to set them down. I worked remotely for a software company that had quietly transformed from flexible tech culture into a 24-hour anxiety machine, where Slack notifications felt like incoming artillery and the boundary between work and the rest of life had eroded so completely that I sometimes sent emails at midnight without noticing I was doing it. For 2 years, our lives had become a loop of waking up, working, eating something fast, watching one episode of something neither of us remembered the next day, then sleeping and starting over. The Italy trip had become this glowing object in the distance that kept us functional. Whenever work got unbearable, Elena would say 3 more months, then 7 more weeks, then 22 days. For the first time in years, I actually felt excited about something in a way that reached through the exhaustion and landed somewhere real. That feeling lasted until my sister called on a Tuesday afternoon, sounding like she'd already been crying before I picked up. Bianca and I had never been the kind of siblings who called each other just to talk. Our relationship existed mostly through family holidays, occasional birthdays, and the random emergencies she constantly found herself inside. There was always something: a flat tire, late rent, a daycare problem, a phone bill that had somehow slipped, a temporary situation that somehow always required money and somehow always pointed in my direction. When we were younger, I used to think she was unlucky. By my 30s, I understood that Bianca moved through life with a quiet assumption that someone else would absorb the consequences of her decisions. That assumption had never been challenged enough to change. She told me Tyler had lost his job. I asked how long ago. She said January. It was September. I stared at the wall and asked how a person gets 8 months into unemployment without saying anything, and she explained that he'd been doing delivery work. When I pressed past the vagueness, the picture emerged piece by piece. Rent problems accumulating for months, credit card debt nobody was paying down, late notices from the building, money borrowed from friends who were now being avoided. As she talked, I realized she wasn't calling to inform me. She was preparing me emotionally for a request that hadn't been named yet. I could hear it in the pacing, in the way she constructed sympathy before getting anywhere near the actual point. I finally asked directly if she was getting evicted. A long silence, and then she said they had put something on the door. Yesterday, when she mentioned almost immediately that my mother already knew, something shifted in how I understood the whole conversation. Because my mother didn't just receive information, she mobilized it. She called before 8 the next morning. The conversation opened with a heavy sigh about not understanding how people let things get this bad, which was impressive given that she was simultaneously criticizing Bianca and preparing to shield her from every consequence. When I asked what the plan was, she said, "Obviously family helps family," in the tone she reserved for introducing demands as universal truths everyone already agreed on. She never framed things as requests because requests could be refused. She spoke in moral absolutes where disagreement made you selfish by definition. I asked what helping meant, specifically. She said obviously they couldn't stay where they were. I pointed out they hadn't been officially evicted yet. She said they would be. We circled for a few minutes, and then she said it plainly. "You have space." When I began to respond, she cut me off before I'd gotten 2 words out, already telling me she knew my tone and that now that Elena and I had money, apparently nobody mattered anymore. I hadn't answered yet. I had barely drawn breath, and she had already scripted the entire argument, assigned my position, and started arguing against it. I said maybe Bianca and Tyler needed to figure out their own situation first. She asked whether I would have preferred they become homeless quietly so I could enjoy my European vacation guilt-free. And there it was, the vacation attached to the crisis, weaponized. Now I understood all those questions about hotel prices. She had been auditing us, calculating what we spent so she'd have a number to hold against Bianca's suffering. When I said we'd spent closer to 6,000 than 8, she delivered her sharpest sarcasm. "Oh well, thank God, that changes everything." Then she said she was disgusted. Not disappointed, not worried, disgusted. As if wanting a real vacation made me rotten at the core. She said if I could afford Europe, I could afford to help my own sister. That sentence stayed with me, because underneath it was a belief she had always carried. Anything good happening to you became community property the second someone else struggled, especially if you were the responsible one. Especially if you were the child who had managed to escape instability. Over the years, I had paid Bianca's overdue utilities twice, covered daycare once, lent money that always became gifts when repayment came up, helped Tyler with his resume, covered my father's medication during an insurance gap, and replaced my parents' refrigerator when my mother described rotting food in enough detail to make saying no feel impossible. Every one of those things disappeared from memory the moment I hesitated about the next one. The ledger only ever showed what you hadn't done yet. I want to be honest about something, though, which is that part of me, a real part, not a small one, understood where the anger was coming from. Not the manipulation, not the guilt tripping, but the raw fear underneath it. Bianca had a kid, a 3-year-old who didn't understand any of this. And however much the adults in the situation had failed to handle things responsibly, that child would sleep wherever the adults ended up sleeping. I knew that. I kept knowing it throughout everything that followed, and I never fully stopped feeling the weight of it, even when I was also furious. When Elena found me at my desk that afternoon staring at the same paragraph of an email for 15 minutes, she asked if my mother had made the ask. I told her the vacation itself was apparently the target, and she didn't look surprised. She said she thought my mother had been planning this since she found out Bianca was behind on rent, that all the questions about costs weren't curiosity, but preparation. The horrible part was that I could see it too, suddenly and clearly. Elena also said quietly that she thought your mother hates me now. I started to argue. Couldn't. My mother only tolerated people who played their assigned roles. Elena had spent 6 years quietly refusing to, and that made her dangerous in my mother's framework. Not because she was hostile, but because she made it possible for me to say no, which disrupted everything. 3 days later, my mother posted a Bible verse on Facebook. That was always how family crises went public in our house. Never directly. Always wrapped first in passive-aggressive spirituality that provided deniability afterward. The verse was about people who see a brother or sister in need but feel no pity, followed by some people forget where they came from. Within 20 minutes, my Aunt Denise had texted asking whether everything was okay with Bianca. My mother never fought privately once she realized private pressure wasn't working. She needed witnesses because witnesses created shame, and shame was her most reliable instrument. I read the post 3 times before putting my phone down. And here's the thing I've been reluctant to admit, even to myself. The first emotion I felt wasn't anger. It was the old familiar pull, the one that had governed most of my adult life. The part of me that thought maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe I should just let them stay for a few weeks. Maybe the vacation could be rescheduled. Maybe the relief of not having this fight hanging over everything was worth more than the principle of it. I had a whole internal argument with myself that lasted maybe 20 minutes, sitting on the bathroom floor with the door closed, running through scenarios. What if we said yes, and it worked out fine? What if Bianca actually got her life together? What if I was making this bigger than it needed to be? Elena knocked on the door after a while and asked if I was okay. I said yes. She said she'd heard the Facebook notification go off and had seen my face change, and she was going to make tea, and I should come out when I was ready. She didn't push. That was the thing about Elena. She never pushed. She just remained in the doorway of things and let me come to them on my own. My father called that evening sounding exhausted before we'd exchanged 10 words. He said my mother was upset and I should try to understand where she was coming from. He used the phrase, "You know how she gets," which had been the family's universal excuse my entire life for converting repeated harmful behavior into something as unchallengeable as weather. He mentioned my mother had told some people I was hesitant to help. He also said, lowering his voice, that my mother thought Elena was influencing me, that I had changed after getting married. I said what had changed was that I'd stopped confusing being useful with being loved. The line went quiet. After a pause, he said I was making this harder than it needed to be. I said I didn't think I was the one who had made it hard. He exhaled and said he just wanted everyone to get along, which I believed. That was genuinely what he wanted, and he had spent 40 years achieving it by absorbing everything rather than confronting anything, and it had cost him things I could see clearly, but he probably couldn't. That night, I made the mistake of trying to explain the situation to an old friend over the phone. Not for advice exactly, more because I needed to say it out loud to someone outside my family to hear how it sounded. He listened to the whole thing, and then was quiet for a moment, and said, "Man, that's rough," and then asked what the apartment in Rome was like. Which was probably the right response, and also completely useless. I lay on the couch after hanging up and thought about how most people, when they hear a story like this, quietly sort themselves into a team within the first few sentences, and the team they sort themselves onto usually says more about their own family than about yours. The people who said I was wrong to hold the line almost always had families where holding the line was never necessary, because the line was never crossed. The people who said I was right almost always had their own version of a mother who did this, a sister who expected this, a history of being the person the money came from when money was needed. I didn't know how to explain that being right and feeling good about being right were two completely separate things, and that I had only reliably achieved one of them. Bianca called that night too. She was crying hard enough that I could barely follow the words. And in the background her son was upset and Tyler was talking loudly about something I couldn't make out. She told me the locks were being changed Friday. Final notice. I tried to work through options with her, Tyler's family, friends with space, short-term rentals, anything, and every road hit a wall. Then her tone shifted, subtly but unmistakably, and she said she couldn't believe I was still thinking about Italy. I recognized my mother's phrasing inside her sentence almost word for word, and I felt a flash of something petty and cold, which was the awareness that this conversation had been coordinated, that it wasn't spontaneous, that the timing of the call, the specific phrasing, the escalating emotional pressure, someone had thought about how to arrange this. And knowing that made it easier to hold the line. But it also made me feel lonely in a way that was hard to explain, because the loneliness wasn't just about the fight. It was about realizing that people I had trusted to be on my side were running a play against me. I said Elena and I had saved almost a year for this trip. Bianca said I could go later. I told her maybe she should have thought about later before ignoring rent for 4 months. I regretted it the second it was out of my mouth, not because it was untrue, but because it was the kind of true that doesn't help anything, the kind that just adds damage without adding understanding. The call ended badly. Bianca said my mother had been right about Elena. I asked what Elena had to do with her not paying rent. She hung up. I sat on the couch for a while after that. Elena came and sat beside me, and didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then she asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I said not yet. She said okay, and we watched half of something neither of us was following, and eventually I told her what had been said, and she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Do you want to cancel the trip?" And the fact that she asked, genuinely asked, without any edge in it, without any stake in the answer, was the thing that made me certain, in that moment, that we weren't canceling. Not because I was angry, because she was the only person in the whole situation who had given me an actual choice. I did not sleep well that night or the one after. I kept running the calculation my mother had planted. $6,000. How far it would go. Whether it would actually fix anything or just delay the next version of this same emergency. Whether I would wake up in 5 years still doing the same math, still being the answer to problems nobody else was willing to prevent. I thought about my nephew, who was 3 and had no idea any of this was happening. And that was the thought that really sat on me, that I couldn't shake loose no matter how firmly I believed I was making the right decision. What arrived at the door at 10:47 that night, I genuinely did not see coming. Not a knock, a pounding. Elena startled in the hallway. I heard my mother's voice first, then Bianca's, and when I looked through the peephole, something cold settled in my stomach. They had luggage. 2 large suitcases, a folded stroller, plastic grocery bags, Bianca with her son against her shoulder half asleep, my mother beside her with the rigid posture she used whenever she decided she was morally correct and was simply waiting for the world to recognize it. My father was visible near the curb, leaning against his truck with the body language of a man who knew this was wrong and had come along anyway, because not coming along felt worse. My first thought, standing there in the dark hallway with my hand on the door, was that I should have seen this coming. My second thought was that I didn't know what I was going to do. And my third thought was that it didn't matter, because the door was there and I had to open it or not open it, and I couldn't stay in the hallway forever. I opened it halfway. My mother said they needed to come inside. I said no, and the word came out before I'd fully decided on it, and I meant it, but I was also aware of my nephew's face over Bianca's shoulder, slack with sleep, and something in my chest did not feel clean about any of this. My mother blinked. I think she genuinely had not prepared for immediate resistance. I asked what they were doing here. Bianca said the locks had been changed tonight. I asked where Tyler was. My mother said he was figuring things out, which meant they'd separated him from the narrative again, edited out so the picture looked like a struggling mother and child rather than 2 adults who'd ignored a problem for months. Elena appeared beside me then, fully awake. The moment my mother saw her, the atmosphere changed. My mother said Elena surely understood this was an emergency. Elena said she understood that arriving unannounced at 11 at night with suitcases was manipulative. My mother said she was trying to keep her grandson from sleeping in a car. Elena asked, quietly, whose fault that was. My mother said Elena had been poisoning me against my family for years. Elena said she hadn't poisoned anything. What she'd done was tell me I was allowed to say no. My mother said you don't come between blood. Elena said you also don't volunteer someone else's home and marriage without asking. Porch lights had started going on down the street. My mother was getting the audience she always eventually got. Bianca asked if I was just abandoning them. She was crying and her son had woken up and was confused and fussing against her shoulder. And I want to be honest about this. I almost broke. Not because of my mother, who I could see clearly by then. Because of my sister's face, which looked genuinely scared in a way that wasn't performance. And because of the kid, who absolutely could not help any of this and didn't understand why he was standing in front of someone's house in the dark while the adults around him fell apart. I said that I was not responsible for fixing every bad decision this family made. My mother called me a selfish little bastard, quietly enough that only we heard it, and then said after everything we did for you, which was the parental debt ledger I had been hearing my entire life. The suggestion that being raised creates an obligation that can always be called in and never fully repaid. I told her that raising me had been her job. Her face changed after that. It didn't crumple immediately. It went still first, and then something moved behind it that I hadn't seen before, and I didn't feel triumphant about it. I just felt tired. She said loud enough for the street that a vacation mattered more to me than my homeless family. I said it wasn't about the vacation, it was that none of them had asked. They had simply decided. She said they were desperate. I said they were controlling. That stopped the conversation in a way nothing else had, because something had been named, and naming things changes them even when nothing else does. She told me everyone had been right about me, that money had changed me, that I thought I was better than everyone. I said I didn't think I was better than anyone. I was just done. She told me I would regret this. My father guided Bianca back toward the truck. My mother stayed at the door a moment longer, and something in her face was genuinely unreadable. Not just anger, something older and more complicated than that. Then she turned and left. I closed the door. Elena and I stood in the hallway not saying anything for a while. Then she said, "You okay?" I said I didn't know. She nodded. We went to bed and I lay awake until past 3, not feeling victorious, not feeling relieved. Just lying there in the dark thinking about my nephew's face and whether any of this was fixable and whether that was even the right question. The 2 weeks before the trip were what I expected and also somehow worse. Relatives sent messages. My mother made a second Facebook post, this one more direct, something about children who forget their parents when things get comfortable. One cousin sent a voice memo, which was new. Apparently a text felt insufficient for the occasion. I blocked people, but each block felt like a small wound rather than a clean amputation. My mother called twice more and I didn't answer, which didn't feel like victory either. It felt like walking past someone drowning and telling myself they'd gotten themselves into the water. Bianca texted me once, for days before our flight. She said Tyler's cousin had a place they could use for a while. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything about the night at the door. She just said they had somewhere to go, and that was all. I sat with that message for a long time. Part of me thought, see, there was a solution available the whole time. They just hadn't looked for it yet. Another part of me thought I'll never know if they would have found it if the door had been open. And I didn't know what to do with not knowing that. My father texted the morning of our flight. "I hope you have a good trip. I wish things were different." I read it 3 times. It was a kind message, and it made me sad in a way the angry ones hadn't. I wrote back, "Me too," and then didn't know what else to say, so I put the phone in my bag. We landed in Rome. The apartment we'd rented was on a small street in Trastevere, 3 flights up, with a window that looked out over rooftops and satellite dishes and one very determined cat on a ledge across the way. The first night, we bought groceries from a shop around the corner and made dinner in a tiny kitchen that had an inexplicably fancy coffee machine and no working burner on the left side of the stove, and we ate standing at the counter because there wasn't really room to sit, and it was the best meal I had eaten in probably 2 years. Not because of the food specifically, which was just pasta and some cheese from a jar, but because of the silence around it. The absence of obligation pressing in through every wall. I still check my phone. I want to say I didn't, but I did. Not constantly, but enough to notice I was doing it, which was its own kind of information. The first 2 days I kept opening the Messages app and then closing it without reading anything, which was somehow more exhausting than just reading the messages would have been, because the act of not reading them required constant maintenance in a way that reading them and putting them down wouldn't have. On the 3rd day, I finally went through everything. My mother's messages, which had shifted from anger into a register I recognized as hurt that wants to look like dignity. A few relatives I hadn't blocked yet. One long message from Bianca that I read twice and still wasn't sure how to feel about. She said she thought I'd become someone she didn't recognize. She said she knew it wasn't all my fault. She said she missed me. She didn't apologize for the night at the door. She didn't address the 8 months of ignored rent. But she said she missed me, and that was real, and it sat with me. I didn't respond to any of them. I muted the threads and put the phone away and went to find Elena, who was sitting in a square nearby drinking a coffee and watching pigeons with the focused appreciation of someone who had not sat in a square in a very long time. I sat beside her. She asked if I was okay. I said I was getting there. She handed me her coffee, and I took a sip and gave it back, and we sat there for a while watching the pigeons and the people and the particular quality of late afternoon light that makes Italian cities look like they're lit from inside. The honest version of how the trip went is that it was good and also complicated. The days were genuinely wonderful. The food, the light, the feeling of being somewhere that had existed for centuries and would exist for centuries after us and had no particular opinion about our family dynamics. But there were moments, usually late at night when Elena was asleep and I was still awake, where I turned everything over again, where I wondered if I'd been too hard on Bianca, who had her own history and her own fears, and had probably not engineered any of this the way my mother had probably just been scared and let my mother take the wheel because that was the path of least resistance. Where I thought about my nephew, who by now had a place to sleep and had no memory of the night at the door, where I try to figure out what a fair version of this situation would have looked like. Not the version where I surrendered everything, but not the version where the door stays closed without even a moment of consideration, and couldn't quite construct it clearly enough to feel sure about anything. I don't have a clean resolution to offer. I called my father from a bench outside the Pantheon on a Wednesday afternoon, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular: his garden, a neighbor's dog, whether the hardware store in town had finally replaced its broken awning. He didn't mention my mother. I didn't mention Bianca. At the end, he said, "Take care of yourself," and I said, "You too." And we hung up, and I sat there for a while looking at something that had been standing for 2,000 years while my family had been falling apart for maybe 2 months. And that perspective didn't fix anything, but it did make everything feel slightly less urgent. Elena and I came home 10 days later. The apartment felt quiet and familiar in a way that took me a minute to recognize as relief. There were no messages I hadn't already seen. The house was the same. The cat was fed by a neighbor and was annoyed about something in her bowl. Normal life had continued in our absence, which was both obvious and somehow comforting. Proof that the world had not actually required my participation in the crisis to keep rotating. The first week back was strange. Not difficult exactly, just strange, the way it always feels when you've been somewhere outside your normal life, and then returned to find that the normal life is still waiting exactly where you left it. I went back to work. Elena went back to her shifts. We got groceries on Sunday. And slowly, the Italy trip moved from being a current thing into being a memory, and what surprised me was that the memory was mostly good. There were the nights lying awake running the math. Yes, and the morning I sat outside the Pantheon wondering if I'd handled everything correctly. And there was the afternoon I found myself drafting and then deleting a response to Bianca's message for 45 minutes, and then finally just closing the app without sending anything. But there was also the pasta in the tiny kitchen and the square with the pigeons and Elena's face across from me at a restaurant on our last night, when she laughed at something I said with the kind of laugh that comes from actual happiness rather than the performance of it. And that was also real, and it was also what we'd been trying to get back to. My mother and I didn't speak for almost 2 months after the trip. When she finally called, on a Sunday morning, she opened by saying she wanted to clear the air, which was her way of announcing that the appropriate cooling-off period had elapsed, and I should be prepared to move forward. The conversation was careful. We talked around the center of things without touching it. She didn't apologize for the night at the door. I didn't ask her to. She said she loved me at the end, and I said I knew. And I meant both things that were inside that response, that I knew she did, and that love and what had happened were 2 separate things I hadn't figured out how to hold together yet. She's called a handful of times since then. The conversations are shorter than they used to be and more surface level, and I don't know if that's a permanent shift or just where we are right now. I genuinely don't know. My father and I talk a little more easily, probably because he was never the one driving any of it, and both of us know that without needing to say it. He called me from the hardware store once to ask if I knew anything about a specific type of exterior paint, which is not a thing I know anything about, and we had a 15-minute conversation about it anyway. And that felt like something. Bianca and I texted a few times through the fall. Small things, a meme she sent, a photo of my nephew doing something funny with a cardboard box. We haven't talked about what happened. I'm not sure when we will or what that conversation looks like. Probably awkward. Probably necessary. I find myself thinking about it sometimes and then putting it down, the same way you put down a problem you know you'll have to solve, but that you don't have the right tool for yet. What I know, sitting with it now, is that I made the right decision. I also know that making the right decision doesn't feel the way people describe it in stories where it's clean, where the person drives away feeling liberated and clear-eyed and free. It felt like something I had to keep making for weeks afterward. Like a door I had to keep choosing to close, because something in me kept wondering if opening it again might somehow produce a different room than the one it had always led to. It hasn't, but I keep having to remind myself of that, which I didn't expect. I thought once you see something clearly, you stay seeing it. Turns out clarity needs maintenance too.